My son said I wasn't his real father, so I took away his BMW. The quiet hum of the television was a familiar, comforting backdrop to an otherwise unremarkable Sunday afternoon. I was on the couch, half watching a game, the drone of the commentators a soothing lullaby, my mind drifting in that pleasant, hazy space between wakefulness and a much-needed nap after a long week of managing a downtown construction project. My 15-year-old daughter, Bristol, was curled in the big armchair opposite me, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her phone screen. She was supposed to be working on a history paper, but the slow, gentle, and utterly secret smile that crept across her lips told a different, more compelling story. It was a beautiful, unguarded expression, the kind of pure, unadulterated happiness that seems to exist only in the young, a sight that made my heart swell with a simple, overwhelming paternal love. I thought about how far we'd come, just the two of us, after her mother left. I thought about the parent-teacher conferences I attended alone, the scraped knees I had bandaged, the bedtime stories I had read. In that fleeting moment, everything felt right, peaceful. I didn't know the Treaty of Versailles could be so charming. I teased, my voice a low, gentle rumble in the quiet room, a simple joke from a father to his daughter. The reaction was anything but peaceful. It was instantaneous and violent. Her head snapped up, the smile vanishing as if it had been a ghost, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated panic that quickly curdled into a defensive rage. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. The peaceful, warm atmosphere in the room evaporated, replaced by a tense, crackling energy that felt like a static shock. "I have a boyfriend, okay, Dad?" she snapped, the words a defensive barrage, each one a shield against my innocent, playful question. "There. Are you happy now?" She shot to her feet, her phone clutched in her hand like a shield, and stormed towards her bedroom, the sound of her footsteps a furious staccato on the polished hardwood floor. The sudden, jarring shift from serene to stormy left me breathless, my mind struggling to catch up with the emotional whiplash. A boyfriend. I knew this day was coming, of course. She was a beautiful, smart, funny kid. Any boy would be lucky to have her. But the hostility, the sheer unadulterated rage in her announcement felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. This wasn't the excited, nervous, giggling confession of a teenager in the throes of a first crush. This was a declaration of war, a line drawn in the sand. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to quell the sudden, frantic beating of my own heart, try to be the calm, rational parent the situation so clearly demanded. "When do I get to meet him?" I called out to her closed door, my voice more strained and tight than I had intended it to be. The bedroom door, which had been slammed shut with a force that rattled the pictures on the hallway wall, flew open again. She stood in the doorway, a cornered, desperate animal, her eyes wide with a pleading fear that I couldn't begin to understand. "You can't," she said, her voice dropping to a frantic, sibilant whisper. "You can't meet him yet. Please, Dad, just not until I turn 16. I promise you, after my birthday, I will explain everything. I swear it." A cold, insidious knot of fear began to form in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't normal teenage secrecy about holding hands in the movie theater. This felt like something darker, something far more dangerous. "Bristol," I said, my voice low and serious, my mind racing through a horrifying Rolodex of worst-case scenarios. "Is someone threatening you? Is he pressuring you to keep him a secret from me?" "No," she cried, her frustration boiling over into a fresh wave of tears. "No one's threatening me. Why do you have to make everything so weird? Why can't you just leave it alone for once?" Before I could formulate a response, before I could try to break through the impenetrable wall she had so violently and suddenly erected between us, my own phone began to ring. Its cheerful, upbeat tone a jarring and unwelcome intrusion into the tense, heavy silence of our standoff. The caller ID flashed a familiar, beloved name, Jacob, my son, my pride and joy, a high-achieving sophomore at the University of Michigan, a 3-hour drive away. I answered, my eyes still locked on my daughter's distraught, tear-streaked face, my mind still reeling from her explosive outburst. "Hey, buddy, what's up?" His voice came through the line, not the usual relaxed, cheerful tone of our weekly check-in calls. It was tight and urgent, a perfect mirror of the very anxiety that was currently coursing through my own veins. "Dad," he said, his words rushed and clipped. "Is Bristol dating someone?" The question was so direct, so bizarrely specific, that the cold knot in my stomach tightened into a solid, heavy ball of ice. He knew something. He knew who it was. And he was scared. "Jacob, you're scaring me," I said, my voice barely a whisper now, my own fear escalating with every passing second. "What is going on? Is my daughter in some kind of danger?" "No, Dad, it's nothing like that," he said, the slight hesitation in his voice doing absolutely nothing to reassure me. "Just listen to me very carefully. Do not investigate this. Do not push her. Do not ask any more questions. Just give her the time she asked for. Give her until her birthday. Please, Dad. For her sake, for my sake, just trust her on this. Okay. And then, before I could ask another question, before I could demand an explanation, he hung up, leaving me standing in a silent house. A bewildered and terrified father caught in a pincer movement between his daughter's desperate, tearful pleas for secrecy and his son's cryptic, terrifying, and equally desperate warning. For 2 long, agonizing, and sleepless weeks, I tried to honor their strange, unified request. It was an act of supreme self-control, a battle waged against every paternal instinct in my body that was screaming at me to dig, to investigate, to uncover the dark and troubling secret that was so potent it had forged an unlikely and clandestine alliance between my 2 children. I tried to respect Bristol's privacy, to pretend that I didn't notice the way she guarded her phone like a state secret, disappearing into her room for hours on end for hushed, whispered conversations. I tried to pretend I didn't see the way her moods would swing from giddy, secretive highs to sullen, inexplicable lows, all seemingly tied to the invisible, unnamed boy on the other end of her screen. I tried to convince myself that this was just a phase, a dramatic but ultimately harmless teenage rite of passage, a story I would one day tell, with a roll of my eyes, at her wedding. But then, she did something so profoundly out of character, so utterly and completely bizarre, that my fragile, crumbling resolve turned to dust. She started doing her own laundry, unprompted, twice a week. This was the same teenager who, just a month prior, had delivered a passionate, 10-minute monologue on why learning how to operate a vacuum cleaner was a tool of the patriarchy designed to keep women in a state of domestic servitude. It was a small, mundane domestic act, but in the context of our new, tense reality, it was a blaring, 5-alarm siren of abnormality. My suspicion, now a ravenous, untamable beast, could no longer be contained. I waited until she was at school the next day, my heart pounding with a self-loathing guilt that made my hands tremble, and I went into her room. It felt like a profound and unforgivable violation, a betrayal of the very trust my son had so desperately asked me to maintain. But the fear, the cold, gnawing, and ever-present fear for her safety, was a more powerful and primal force. As I was emptying her hamper into the laundry basket, my fingers brushed against a thick, unfamiliar fabric. I pulled it out. Tucked beneath a pile of her own brightly colored, trendy clothes was an oversized, navy blue hoodie. The bold, yellow, and instantly recognizable letters emblazoned across the chest spelled out, University of Michigan. Jacob's School. It was a tangible link, a piece of irrefutable, physical evidence that connected my son, my responsible, high-achieving son, my golden boy, to my daughter's dark and troubling secret. That evening, when she walked in the door from school, her face a mask of teenage indifference. I held it up, my own expression a carefully constructed mask of casual curiosity. This yours? Her reaction was instantaneous and telling. Her face went from its usual pale ivory to a deep, blotchy, and undeniable red in a matter of seconds. Oh, yeah, she stammered, her eyes darting everywhere, but at me, a cornered animal searching for an escape. She snatched the hoodie from my hand as if it were on fire. It's my boyfriend's. I got it at a thrift store. You know, like a boyfriend-style hoodie, but from a thrift store. The lie was so clumsy, so transparently false, that it was almost painful to witness. She clutched the hoodie to her chest like a holy relic and scurried to the safety of her room, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with the ugly, unthinkable, and now almost certain truth solidifying in my gut like a block of cold cement. That night, unable to sleep, my mind a relentless racetrack of horrifying and increasingly plausible possibilities, I was walking to the kitchen for a glass of water around 2 in the morning when I heard her voice. It was a muffled, urgent whisper from behind her closed bedroom door. I froze, my bare feet silent on the cool hardwood floor, and pressed my ear against the wood, a spy in my own home. I know, she was saying, her voice thick with a stress and a weariness that sounded far too old for a 15-year-old. I know, but I can't keep doing this. The lying is absolutely killing me. There's a long, silent pause, and in that silence, I imagine the voice on the other end of the line, calm and reassuring, the voice of my own son, talking his younger sister down from a moral and emotional ledge of his own making. Because my dad will kill us when he finds out who you are, she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of fear and a desperate, heartbreaking despair. You know he will. The next morning, the evidence of their secret became physical, a dark, ugly, and undeniable mark on my daughter's pale skin. She came downstairs for breakfast wearing a turtleneck, a strange and conspicuous choice for a warm late spring day. New fashion statement? I asked, my voice a little too bright, a little too forced as I desperately tried to maintain the crumbling charade of normalcy in our home. Just trying something different, she mumbled, her eyes fixed on the refrigerator door as if it held the secrets to the universe. As she reached into the fridge for the carton of orange juice, the high, tight collar of the turtleneck shifted for a fraction of a second, revealing a dark, purplish, and unmistakable mark on the pale, vulnerable skin of her neck. A hickey. She saw me see it. Her eyes widened in a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, and she frantically yanked the collar back into place, her face flaming with a mixture of a deep, profound guilt and a defiant, teenage anger. Without another word, she turned and fled back to the sanctuary of her room, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, the image of that ugly, possessive bruise burned onto the back of my eyelids. The pattern of their deception became painfully, undeniably clear in the weeks that followed. It was a carefully and meticulously choreographed dance of avoidance and misdirection. Every time Jacob would mention the possibility of a weekend visit home, Bristol would suddenly have unavoidable and last-minute plans. A sleepover at her friend Ashley's that I now knew was a lie, a group project for school that never seemed to materialize. Every time I knew for a fact that Bristol was out of the house, staying the night with a friend, Jacob would suddenly be swamped with studying and too busy to take my calls. They were meticulously and with a desperate, almost comical precision, avoiding being in the same place at the same time, maintaining the flimsy, transparent illusion that their worlds, their lives were separate. Mother's Day was the breaking point, the day their intricate and insulting web of lies finally began to unravel completely. It had become our solemn and often painful tradition in the 3 years since my beloved wife's passing to visit her grave together. A quiet, somber pilgrimage for the three of us to the place where our family's heart was buried. But this year, the tradition was shattered. Jacob called the day before, his voice strained with a poorly feigned, almost insulting apology that made my blood run cold. Sorry, Dad. I have a huge project due on Monday. I can't make it home this weekend. It's Mother's Day, Jacob, I said, the disappointment a sharp, bitter sting in my chest, a fresh wound layered on top of the old, ever-present grief. I know. I'm really, really sorry, he said, and then he hung up before I could reply. A coward fleeing from a conversation he didn't have the courage to have, a son who was choosing a lie over his own mother's memory. An hour later, as if on cue, Bristol made her own, equally hollow, announcement. She, too, would be unable to come to the cemetery. She claimed, sleeping over at Ashley's house that night. A cold, cynical suspicion, born of weeks of their transparent lies, prompted me to do something I had never done before. I called Ashley's mother. She sounded genuinely confused and surprised when I asked to confirm the sleepover, but after a moment's hesitation, a moment where I could practically hear the gears of teenage loyalty and a daughter's desperate plea turning her mind, she said yes, of course. Bristol was welcome to come over. She was covering for her, just as Jacob was. They weren't just lying to me anymore. They were recruiting their friends' parents, into their growing conspiracy of silence. They were together. I knew it with a sickening, soul-deep certainty. The final, irrefutable, and in many ways, most insulting piece of evidence came a week later, in the form of a bank statement. A $300 withdrawal from the college savings account I managed for Bristol. The charge was from a restaurant in Ann Arbor, a popular, trendy, and ridiculously expensive spot right next to Jacob's campus. When I confronted her with the printed statement, her house of cards finally, spectacularly collapsed. She offered another flimsy, insulting lie about an online SAT prep course that required an in-person registration fee. But for the first time, she couldn't look me in the eye. That was it. I was done. I was done with the lies. I was done with the secrecy. I was done with the cryptic warnings and the suffocating, unbearable tension. I needed the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how much it was going to destroy me. That Saturday, on what should have been our quiet family visit to my wife's grave, I found myself on the highway, the car pointed north, driving the 3 long, silent hours to the University of Michigan, my heart a cold, heavy dead stone in my chest. Jacob's off-campus apartment was in a run-down, depressing building that smelled faintly of stale pizza and a kind of youthful, collegiate regret. I knocked on his door, the sound echoing in the quiet, deserted hallway, my own heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm in my ears, a drumbeat of impending doom. The door opened, and he stood there. The color drained from his face when he saw me, his expression a theatrical mixture of pure, unadulterated panic and a strange, almost resigned guilt, the look of a man who knew he had finally been caught. "Dad," he started, his voice a panicked, breathless whisper, "we need to talk about Bristol." And then, from inside the apartment, I heard her voice, light and carefree, a sound that twisted the knife that was already embedded deep in my gut. "Is that the pizza?" She appeared behind him then, a vision from my worst and most unimaginable nightmares, the living, breathing confirmation of a truth I had so desperately refused to let myself believe. She was wearing a slinky, cheap-looking satin bathrobe that barely covered her body, her makeup smudged and smeared for what I could only assume was a long night. Her beautiful, long hair, the hair she had been so meticulously and proudly growing out since middle school, chopped into a short, edgy, and alarmingly sophisticated style that made her look older, harder, a stranger I didn't recognize. We stood there, the three of us frozen in a silent, horrifying tableau of discovery and profound, earth-shattering betrayal. "Dad," Jacob began again, his voice shaking, desperately trying to seize control of the situation that was spiraling into an abyss of his own making. "Before you say anything, you need to remember this is legal." Legal. The word was a slap in the face, a cold, clinical, and utterly irrelevant term that had no place in this vortex of emotional and familial devastation. "Bristol isn't your biological daughter," he said, the words spilling out in a desperate, rehearsed, and almost robotic rush. "She's your late wife's daughter from her first marriage. We're not related by blood. We're step-siblings." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the technical, legalistic defense he was so calmly and rationally offering for this profound, unthinkable, and morally bankrupt betrayal. "She's 15, Jacob." I managed to choke out, the words feeling like sandpaper in my dry, raw throat. "You're a sophomore in college. You're 20. We fell in love," Bristol said then, her voice thick with what I knew were performative, teenage tears, as if that simple, childish phrase, that cheap, dime store romantic notion, could somehow excuse or justify the monumental wrongness of it all. "We couldn't fight it. Plus, I'm 16 soon." That was when something inside me, some primal protective circuit breaker that had been straining under the pressure for weeks, finally snapped. The grief for my wife, the fear for my daughter, the weeks of simmering, helpless, and impotent rage, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot, and blinding point of pure, unthinking fury. I swung. My fist connected with my son's face with a sickening, wet, and unforgettable crunch. He staggered backward, collapsing onto the floor of his own apartment, his hands flying to his nose as a bright, crimson stream of blood began to gush between his fingers. Bristol screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound, and rushed to his side, trying to help him up while simultaneously, and with a strange, almost comical, modesty, clutching her flimsy robe closed. The sight of the blood, my son's blood, my own blood, dripping onto the cheap, stained, and disgusting apartment carpet, finally broke through the red haze of my rage. My own knuckles throbbed, a dull, distant pain that felt like it was happening to someone else. My entire body began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor of shock and adrenaline and a profound, bottomless horror at what I had just done. I had just punched my own son. I had just become the kind of father, the kind of man that I had always, and with a deep, self-righteous conviction, sworn I would never be. I backed out of the doorway, stumbling into the hall, my legs suddenly weak and uncooperative. I heard Jacob yell, his voice muffled and thick with blood, that he was calling the cops, but Bristol's voice, pleading and frantic, begged him not to, her words a garbled, hysterical mess of "it'll make everything worse for everyone." "This isn't over," I managed to say, the words feeling like they belonged to a stranger, and then I turned and fled, a coward running from the wreckage of his own making, a father who had just destroyed what was left of his own family. The 3-hour drive home was a fugue state of pure, unadulterated shock and a deep, soul-crushing self-loathing. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and the image of Bristol in that tiny, cheap robe, her face a mask of fear and a defiant, misplaced love, was burned onto the back of my eyelids. I had to pull over twice, once at a brightly lit sterile gas station and again at a desolate, dark rest stop, to retch violently in the parking lot, my body physically rejecting the horror of what I had seen, of what I had done. My phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and texts from Bristol, 17 of them in total, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I couldn't speak to her, not yet. I didn't know what I would even say to the daughter I had so profoundly failed to protect. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, I just sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, the familiar silence of the garage, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The house was dark and empty, a hollow, silent shell that only amplified my own profound and all-encompassing sense of desolation. I collapsed onto the couch in the living room, the events of the day of the past few weeks playing on a relentless, torturous loop in my mind. I was a father who had not only failed to protect his daughter from his own son, but had then physically assaulted that son in a fit of uncontrollable, animalistic rage. Sleep was an impossibility, a distant, unattainable country. My mind was a racetrack of what-ifs and recriminations, each thought more poisonous and self-flagellating than the last. Around 4 in the morning, as the first pale and unforgiving light of dawn began to creep through the windows, a cold, hard, and brutal clarity began to emerge from the chaos of my thoughts. I was at my depth. My own anger and my own grief were making me a danger to my own children. I needed help. I needed anyone who knew how to navigate this kind of unthinkable, catastrophic, and deeply personal mess. The first thing I did when the sun came up, my hand still shaking, my heart still a heavy, dead weight in my chest, was call Child Protective Services. The woman who answered the phone listened patiently, her voice a calm, steady, and blessedly professional presence in a storm of my own frantic, disjointed explanation. Her tone shifted from a standard bureaucratic boredom to a serious, focused concern, and she scheduled a caseworker to visit my house later that week. The next 2 days were a slow, agonizing crawl toward that meeting, a period of suspended animation where every ring of the phone, every unexpected noise, sent a jolt of pure, undiluted panic through my system. On Wednesday morning, a woman named Paige Morrow, armed with a thick folder and a serious, no-nonsense expression that I found strangely comforting, sat at my kitchen table and explained the process in a clear, concise, and blessedly unemotional manner. They would need to interview Bristol at school, without me present, in order to get her uninfluenced account of the situation. They would launch a formal investigation into Jacob, and they would work with me, she explained, to create a comprehensive safety plan to ensure that Bristol was protected, both physically and emotionally. I handed over my own growing file of evidence. The bank statements, the photograph of the Michigan hoodie, the detailed timeline of their lies and deceptions that I had spent the last 2 sleepless days compiling. That night, a text from Jacob appeared on my phone, a pathetic, cowardly, and self-serving plea for understanding, a claim that nothing sexual had happened until very recently, and a desperate, transparent request that I not ruin his life over this. I screenshotted it, my disgust a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, and added it to the folder. The days that followed were a descent into a bureaucratic and jurisdictional nightmare. There were endless, frustrating phone calls, a constant, demoralizing feeling of being shuffled from one indifferent, overworked department to another. Was this a matter for our home county or for the county where Jacob lived and the assault had occurred? Was it a campus police issue or a state issue? No one seemed to know, and, more disturbingly, no one seemed to particularly care. In the midst of this administrative chaos, I called Ashley's mom, who, horrified and guilt-ridden, provided a sworn, notarized statement confirming the litany of fake sleepovers, her voice thick with an anger and a sense of betrayal that mirrored my own. When Paige finally interviewed Bristol at school, the result was a predictable, but no less painful, explosion. Bristol came home that afternoon and unleashed a torrent of pure, unadulterated rage, screaming that I had ruined her life, that I had betrayed her trust, that I had portrayed Jacob as a monster when they were simply in love. The slammed doors and the screaming matches, once a rare occurrence in our quiet, peaceful home, became the new, ugly soundtrack of our lives. Paige called later that evening, her voice carefully, professionally neutral, confirming that Bristol's answers to her questions showed concerning patterns of manipulation, of coaching of a young girl who had been so thoroughly gaslit that she could no longer distinguish between love and abuse. The next day, I hired a lawyer, a tired-looking but sharp-witted man named Ken Roberts, who, after hearing my story, bluntly and without any sugarcoating, informed me that I could, and likely would, face assault charges for punching Jacob. The law, he explained with a weary sigh, didn't care about the context. Assault was assault. At his immediate and urgent advice, we filed for a temporary protective order to legally, and with the force of the court, keep Jacob away from Bristol. The new, court-mandated house rules that came with it, a strict 7 p.m. curfew, no phone after 9 p.m., were met with a plate of spaghetti being thrown against the living room wall, the red sauce splattering like a crime scene, a Jackson Pollock of my daughter's rage and despair. In the midst of this domestic war, while searching for an old insurance document, I made a crucial, game-changing discovery. A shared family cloud account, a digital relic from years ago, an account they must have thought was long forgotten and abandoned. It contained hundreds of messages between them, a complete, unedited, and digital transcript of their secret relationship going back months. I read through them, each word, each emoji, each shared secret a fresh stab to my already broken heart. Jacob, my son, my golden boy, meticulously and with a chilling, predatory precision, coaching his 15-year-old stepsister on how to lie to me, on how to cover her tracks, on how to manipulate every single situation. It was a cold, calculated, and sustained campaign of deception, and I now had every last damning word of it. The situation, already a raging inferno, came to a head when Bristol, in a desperate and misguided act of defiance, ran away. She took a bus to Michigan, back to him. The police, alerted by a GPS tracker on her phone that I had reluctantly activated, found her at his apartment, safe but unrepentant. She had gone willingly. Two stoic, unsympathetic, and clearly annoyed officers brought her home in the middle of the night, and she walked past me without a single word, her hatred a palpable, suffocating force in the small, silent house. The school counselor called the next day, her voice grave and deeply concerned. Bristol was failing her classes, withdrawing from her friends, and showing all the classic, textbook signs of profound trauma. We scheduled a family therapy session with a highly recommended crisis specialist named Abigail Morgan. The first session was a revelation, a tiny, fragile breakthrough in the seemingly impenetrable wall of our shared anger and grief. In the safe, neutral space of Abigail's quiet, calm office, faced with a professional and compassionate third party, I finally did what I had been unable to do on my own. I admitted that punching Jacob was a mistake, a complete and utter failure of my own emotional control, a betrayal of my own values as a father. The admission, the simple, unadorned act of taking responsibility for my own actions, seemed to crack through Bristol's formidable and seemingly impenetrable wall of anger. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a surprise that bordered on shock, and for the first time in months, she agreed to try. To work on not screaming at me if I worked on not controlling her. It was a tiny, fragile, and almost imperceptible truce in our ongoing, brutal war, but it was a start. The legal system, in its own slow, methodical, and often frustrating way, continued to grind forward. The protective order was extended indefinitely. The university, after conducting its own thorough and damning investigation, suspended Jacob indefinitely, pending the outcome of the criminal case. And the prosecutor's office, armed with the mountain of digital evidence I had provided, began to build their case. But the real, meaningful, and lasting change began to happen in Abigail's quiet, calm, and sunlit office. Week by week, with Abigail as our gentle, patient, and incredibly skilled guide, the layers of Bristol's anger, her defiance, her misplaced loyalty, began to peel back, revealing the scared, confused, and profoundly manipulated 15-year-old underneath. Jacob's lawyer, in a move of legal strategy, sent a letter, a formal, 3-page apology for my son. He took full and complete responsibility, acknowledging the power imbalance, the inherent and unforgivable wrongness of their relationship, given their respective ages and roles in our family. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stated the facts. Bristol read the letter in the silence of her room, and though she didn't speak of it for a week, something inside her, some final, tangled knot of confusion and misplaced love, finally shifted. She stopped defending him. She stopped screaming about true love. She started talking, really, truly talking in therapy about the secrets, the pressure, the confusion, the guilt, the shame. My own court date came and went. I pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of disorderly conduct, accepting a hefty fine and 12 weeks of mandatory anger management classes. It was a humbling, but necessary, consequence for my own loss of control. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, our broken, war-torn house began to quiet. The screaming matches were replaced by tense, but civil conversations. The slammed doors were replaced by soft, respectful clicks. One evening, I overheard Bristol on the phone with one of her new friends from summer school. "No, he's not my boyfriend anymore," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm deleting his number now." The next morning, the Michigan hoodie, the original, tangible symbol of their secret, was in a donation bag by the front door. The prosecutor, seeing Jacob's genuine remorse, his willingness to accept consequences without a fight, and most importantly, seeking to spare Bristol the profound and re-traumatizing experience of testifying in a public trial, offered a plea deal, misdemeanor charges, a period of probation with deferred sentencing, and a permanent, legally binding no-contact order that would follow him into adulthood. It felt too lenient, a mere slap on the wrist for a crime that had stolen my daughter's innocence and shattered our family. But Ken, my lawyer, and Abigail, our therapist, both gently reminded me that the primary goal here was not revenge, but Bristol's healing, her protection. With a heavy, and still somewhat resentful, heart, I agreed. Summer arrived, and with it, a new, tentative, and fragile routine. Summer school for Bristol to catch up on the months of her education she had lost to this chaos. Chores. And, eventually, evenings with new friends from her classes, friends who knew nothing of the drama, who saw her not as a victim or a troublemaker, but just as a normal teenage girl. She got a part-time job at a local ice cream shop, and her laughter as she came home, her uniform shirt stained with chocolate sauce, was a sound I thought I might never hear again, a sound that was more precious to me than any court victory. On a quiet Sunday, what would have been my beloved wife's birthday, I sat by her grave for a long time, and I talked to her a long, rambling, one-sided conversation about my failures, my fears, my desperate, and now burgeoning hope that I was finally, after all of this, doing the right thing, that I was finally becoming the father our children deserved. When I got home that afternoon, Bristol was in the kitchen, making eggs for a late lunch. We ate in a comfortable, easy silence, a father and a daughter, slowly, cautiously, and with a great deal of trepidation, finding our way back to each other in the wreckage. The healing is not over. It is not linear. It is a messy, complicated, two steps forward, one step back dance. But we are dancing. We are trying. And for the first time in a very, very long time, our broken little family feels the quiet, steady, and unmistakable rhythm of hope.